Welcome to our class. Hope you're doing well and having a decent week. I got another, I hope, kind of interesting topic for you. I've played around with different titles for this over time as I've developed it, but kind of stuck with this self versus other, which is a weird title, right? Like what would that imply? What would it imply that there's this complex dynamic between you and the other yous that make up the social world that you're in, the fact that we're all in these interactive, complex social structures, and how that shapes our experience, and how that's like the complexity is incredibly high in adulthood, right? Like the complexity of how these interpersonal dynamics shape how we see things and understand ourselves and understand information we're seeing and even what's real. It's like this all comes from this complicated nature nurture thing that you're a human being having an experience in a world, and your world is full of other human beings having experiences, and there's almost an endless number of dynamics at play. And social cognition is going to be looking at, so the subtitle here, exploring the complexities of human interaction from a social cognitive perspective. So from a perspective focused on how the social world is affecting our cognition, like our actual processing of our situation. So yeah, I hope that you find this interesting. This is sort of like a special additional presentation. There's a few of these where they're not directly related to the textbook, but yeah, on the next slide, I'm going to kind of show you where the inspiration for this presentation comes from. And I wanted to just make the note of, these are, and I say this sometimes maybe too much, that these are like weird times, and you're good people, and if you're struggling at all, it's like a lot of it's not you. It's like these last few years have been tough, and I think we have to give ourselves some grace and a pat on the back a bit if we're still fighting and if we're still pushing forward. And it's like respect and support each other, and I don't know. I know I record something for you once a week, but like I appreciate the role that you play in my life. And anyways, I won't get all emotional on the first slide. Anyways, it's just like I think be gentle on ourselves is my message, because we're good people working hard. And what I want to talk about today is how some of us have also been being exposed to high levels of, is brainwashing too strong a word? And so, from all sides. And how does that shape how we make sense of everything? And how does that influence our families? And how does that influence our friendships and our relationships and our, all these things, like all these complex social cognitive variables. All right. Hopefully that interested you a tiny bit, and that's kind of my intro ramble. Let's get into some pretty cool ideas, right? So this is going to be, again, looking at it from a social cognitive perspective. So I'm not sure if I've spoken to you specifically about Zivdakunda yet, but she was one of my favorite professors. She's not alive anymore, but during my time at University of Waterloo, and she was a social cognition, an expert in social cognition, and she wrote this book, and it's over there somewhere. But this presentation is sort of a summary of 3 of the chapters of the book, right? So this book, you don't have to buy the book, or you'll notice in the readings for this week I have several readings from Kunda that will give you like a really good vibe of what it is. It's worth getting, like but you don't need it for any assignments or anything like that. This is kind of a book review of it, 3 of the chapters. Right? And she's a very brilliant scholar, and her not always the most interesting presenter, but Um, the ideas are super high level, and I always found her class interesting. I didn't really know anyone in that class, and it was one of those a weird class at Waterloo that was huge. And I can remember like kind of sometimes coming in and kind of sneaking in the back and just sitting there and being like she had a sort of boring style, but like the ideas were top notch. Like this first one, like what's the difference between things that our brain does automatically and things that we have conscious control over, and how do we actually start to break that down? And so like that's going to be the first sort of subtopic today, is this idea of what does it mean to say that we do something that's a mental operation automatically. And I'm going to show you some cool ways of talking about that with all these things. The second thing we're going to look at is this idea of like, no, how we assume, and oftentimes incorrectly, what other people think or why they behave the way that they do, or how we attribute things to people's personalities. So this is all looking at how we're social processing. And then the third one, determining what is, what was, and what might be. The role of bias, right? But I want to talk about bias not just in like the standard 2024 way of like everybody's terrible, but like from a perspective of, no, what does it mean to have a cognitive bias? What does it mean to actually have like to want to see something go a certain way so much that it's actually affecting you at a perceptual level, that you're not just lying, that you're actually kind of experiencing or seeing it that way. And what's the relationship then between sensation and perception, and how can a cognitive commitment actually affect your perception? Like we say that all the time, right? Like, oh, this shapes how you see the world. This shapes how you see the world. What does that actually mean? What does it actually mean to shape your cognitive visor through which you're looking at your reality? Like you couldn't make a deeper claim about the nature of experience than to say that something fundamentally shifted how I experience my whole world, as if I'm playing a different video game. It's like, that's a pretty astounding claim. Okay, so anyways, let's get into this. I'm ready to go. So then if you look at this first slide, right, this is like the title page of section 1, automatic processes. And I want you to just think for a sec, like, what does it mean to say that you make judgments and you behave on the basis of those judgments, and it's happening at a level that's below your cognitive threshold? It's below what that car is coming a little bit too much into your lane. You've slightly moved this way, and you're like kind of doing a defensive maneuver already before you've kind of even had the thought. What's happening there? How is the automatic, and I'm resisting using the term unconscious, because automatic and unconscious aren't the exact same terms, but there's interesting overlap, and I'll try to talk about that a bit. But what does it mean that something's happened, you've done something so many times that it becomes automatic, and that you can actually be making? And is that what like a stereotype is then? Is that just like an automatic judgment that happened without your intention necessarily, that affected how you're perceiving a situation? And it's actually it's not like a motivational or you're a bad person. It's actually like a cognitive processing thing. It's like an in-group bias that we've known about for a long time in psychology. So my point is, like, where is the bias actually occurring? Is it like at an emotional, moral, rational level, or is it at an automatic processing, categorization, mental sorting, categorization level, right? And like, I think that's actually the core of the question. That's the heart of the question. So a judgments in behavior without awareness, intention, control, or effort. What does it mean to say that the computer in your brain just does things, right? You're not controlling the operations. You're not giving it the keyboard shortcuts for everything. Sometimes you are. Sometimes you're trying to think through things, and it has that conscious awareness, that purposefulness, that intention. But what about that effort, that control, that awareness? But what about, that was a tongue twister. What about when it doesn't? All right. All right. So yeah, in that book, right? So I got it with me now. Right, this Making Sense of People book. She starts out chapter 7 talking about this, the difference between automatic and controlled processes, and definitely have that in your notes, right? The idea of like, okay, if you look at this idea of, okay, so automatic, what does it mean to say that you kind of do it automatic, right? Like that whatever it's something that happens or a process that occurs outside of awareness. You're not meaning to do it, right? It's like, so what would be an example of that? Like, let's say if you like see somebody and it reminds you of someone. It's not like you looked at that person and thought, I wonder who this looks like. Like you thought you had that connection, like almost like automatically, right? That's just a freestyled example, but to just kind of say this idea of like not intentional, not effortfully, purposefully done, and that like, so to keep going here, uncontrollable in that one could not stop it once it's begun, highly efficient, requires low cognitive resources. Your brain's sort of doing this without. She also starts to get into this interesting point that as your brain gets more automatic, as things are more automatic, they're more efficient. And actually, if you're trying to do something and I challenge you with another cognitive task and it interferes with you doing it, that's almost by definition proof that it's a controlled process, that you're putting current resources towards it and it's not something going on behind the scenes, right? And so she's trying to, again, not to overly complicate the very first slide, but what she's trying to say here is, and what this point is that your brain's sort of kind of doing multiple layers of things, right? Like some of the things are directly under your control, like, and that's what, and directly under your control. So here's the language for the second one, right? A controlled process. So this is being carried out with intention and awareness. You doing things on purpose, basically, right? You could be controlled and monitored, requires considerable effort, right, to stay focused on something, and that you can almost tell that, as I say, there's so much so that it can be disrupted when cognitive resources are limited, that the more you're being stressed with additional cognitive tasks only decreases how efficient you are if it's talking controlled. Basically what I'm saying is, like, if you view your brain as a computer, the things that you're doing automatically are like stressing the computer less. They're doing that with like greater efficiency, right? But like the amount of bandwidth or whatever that you're able to put to thinking right now is much more limited, much more scarce in terms of resources. And the more, and that's almost provable by the fact that you just can't, like, you can't think about you can't talk about a certain thing and think about a math problem and do this all at the same time, because you know you're working, it's like really almost talking about the limits of the working memory of like the controlled, conscious, intentional part of your thinking process is part of your cognition, part of your cognitive psychology. And then there's this whole automatic part of your cognitive psychology too. Okay, so there's my first slide. I just have like a couple, like if you see this book, it's like got all kinds of blue highlighter. I was just apparently in a blue highlighter phase. Originally, it was thought that automatic and controlled processes were completely distinct, mutually exclusive. Each process was assumed to be either fully automatic, that is characterized by all the features of automaticity, basically meaning like doing it without control, or fully control, in that it was completely under conscious control. However, it later became evident that few, if any, higher order cognitive processes safely or satisfy these stringent criteria. Rather, many processes are automatic in some regards and controlled in others. For example, if you're an experienced driver, you drive for miles without any awareness of the mechanics of driving, like how hard, okay, so like an example of that would be like how hard you're pushing down on the pedal. You're not sitting that, maybe when you're first learning to drive, you're thinking that, but if you've driven for years, you're not thinking about how hard you're squeezing the steering wheel. You're not thinking about how hard you're pushing. You're not thinking necessarily about like how you're checking. Like you're just doing all these things, right? This is kind of an example of automatic. So just to back that sentence up, for example, if you're an experienced driver, you may drive for miles without any awareness of the mechanics of driving, and your driving may be so effortless that you can listen to music and carry on a conversation at the same time. In these ways, your driving is automatic. Yet your driving lacks other features of automaticity, being automatic. It cannot be considered unintended. You'd made a conscious decision to go on this ride, nor is it uncontrollable. You choose to stop, you monitor yourself at all times. Many processes of social judgment are similar. They're a mixture of both automatic and controlled features. She goes on to use an example that say, for example, stereotype activation can be both unintended, a feature of automatic processes, and effortful, a feature of controlled processes. Right? So like, say you have a stereotypical thought that might have been triggered by something automatic and then thought about controlled process. All right, I'll keep going with these examples. Obviously, we're on slide 4. I'm going to keep going. I hope you're enjoying this. Like, this is. So, why am I doing this presentation? I'm trying to say to you, like, I think that this course, in a certain sense, is about adult development, right? And there's an aspect of adult development that's cognitive and it's social cognitive. And in my opinion, this is the best. Kunda had something to say to you, right? I would just say it like that. Like, I care about you students, and I think that there's something to say here. Okay, so I'm trying to like justify my PowerPoint, but let's just go to the next slide. So when you're doing this, if you're wondering what I'm doing, I'm just sort of like, I thought this would be a cool way to do it and a little bit different, right? I'm kind of doing a book review idea. So I've created this PowerPoint that's like on the screen, sort of what I'm hoping that you're taking down as your notes. And then even if you were to like say have this book, you would see that it's kind of structured in a similar way as this presentation. And so I'm going to kind of read pieces as we go. So kind of my point is like focus for your notes sort of on, please, on like what's on the screen, and then view this as like sort of additional content. So this idea of failure of introspection, of that we're actually not great at knowing why we did certain things, and that we're not always the best at weighing factors. We can be completely unaware of the role that factors played in influencing our judgments, right? And I was going to read that under this paradigm, we conclude that people are unaware of the causes of their judgments and behaviors because they often deny the role that certain things, the role of causes known to have influenced their reaction. People can't always be trusted to correctly report how various factors influenced responses. So they did this study. Okay, so here I want to read the study to you because basically I'll tell you it quick, right? And basically it's like you take a group of people and you prime one group of people, you flash them something, right? A prime is just basically like exposing you to some kind of information, whether a sound or a sight or a image or whatever. Prime means coming first, and the idea is if I show you something, I flash like a glass of water really quick, so quick that you didn't really notice it, like almost subliminal perception. Flash it so quick that you don't necessarily notice it, but then then later can I see if it influences your behavior, and if it influences your behavior, we would say that that image primed your behavior, right? It had like it was something that happened before that affected something that happened later, increased the likelihood of some behavior or whatever. So here's the idea, right? It's like people. Let's see if I can quickly say this. Okay, so the people that were primed and not primed were. Okay, so let me read this to you. This is kind of interesting. In one study, okay, so here's the idea. It's like I have you read a bunch of stuff, and I was just kind of thinking how far to go back, but I kind of need to just read both these pages, or else it's going to be a bit harder to summarize. Okay, so in one study, the authors first primed the concepts of rudeness and politeness, and then, in a seemingly unrelated context, we're trying to examine whether such priming could lead people to behave in rude and polite manners. So, like, could I like have you in class like all write an essay on the virtues of friendliness or something, and then observe you later and see if that had any effect on like how nice you are, maybe to like a new person that enters the room, right? Can we show any connection between whatever and whatever, right? The prime and the effect of the prime. Participants were told they'd take part in two separate studies on language. Their first task was to unscramble a series of scrambled sentences. Each included 5 scrambled words, such as he hates, he it hides, finds instantly, from which participants, so that's like a weird sentence, right? From which participants were to construct a correct 4-word sentence as fast as they could. Like, he instantly hides. He instantly hides it. I guess that would be 4 words. This task was used to prime their desired concepts. Participants received one of 3 versions of the task. In one, their intended prime traded they're primed for rudeness. Half the sentences included words related to rudeness. Right, so basically, without reading this whole entire thing, it's basically like I have one group of people do a task where everything they're reading about is about rudeness, and then in this other group I have it all about friendliness, and then I put them in some scenario and we see that it actually does sort of influence behavior. But when you ask people about it, they'll say that it had no influence, right? And this is sort of my point, is that like when questioned later, none reported any suspicion that the priming manipulation had influenced their behavior in any ways. It appears that we may be completely unaware of the ways in which subtle aspects of a situation can govern our social behavior, right? So the point of the study, it's like at a certain point, who cares about the word puzzles? The idea was that get one group of people all thinking about how rude everybody is, getting all upset about stuff. Then you put them in a situation, you see that actually like affects them, but they're actually not aware of how much it affects them, and they actually underplay that variable. And that's what we call this failure of introspection, this failure of seeing why we're actually doing what we're doing. Sorry, that was like that took a while to explain that study, but I hope you kind of get that concept. This is a problem, right? Why is it a problem? Well, it's if you want to have like an accurate view of your reality, if that matters to you, if you want to like be able to see through the matrix a little bit, it's like we have to be, that's a wild picture of the woman looking back at her layers of self. So I want to kind of also make the point that so this book was published in 1999. So some of the language around some of this has changed a bit, right? So nowadays we talk a lot about this idea of like episodic and procedural memory, that like why an amnesia patient can still tie their shoes but can't maybe remember what happened yesterday is because the memory related to tying your shoes and the memory is more a procedural memory, and that's stored differently than like this sort of story of your life episodic memories. But Kunda's looking at this like from a different perspective, sort of, and looking at this idea of not just that, but how it's actually like kind of influencing your in the moment processing, and that um Yeah, like although amnesic patients often have little conscious memory of past experiences, their subsequent judgment and behaviors can still be influenced by traces of those experiences. So like what's that mean? That's a wild thought. So that sort of means like, so say an amnesic patient, which is the word she just used, and I'm just gonna go with her language. Um, if an amnesic patient is okay, so here's my example, is exposed to somebody and the person's like, say, super mean to them and like yelling at them, right? So someone with amnesia, imagine this scenario, the person's like screaming at them and stuff, and then they see them the next day, and you might ask the person, like, do you remember this person? And they might say no, but they might be like a little tiny bit more reserved, which is like super interesting, right? It's almost like you're seeing almost like this hint. And again, it's not like saying that that's always the case, but that it's trying to get at this difference between what an explicit memory is and what an implicit memory is. That there can, and this is sort of a lot of what Freud thought about it, the unconscious, and how these early life experiences influence us, that even if we don't have a connection to like the play-by-play story, what the movie of the situation would be, that kind of explicit memory, this like conscious recollection, a recollection of thoughts related to some early experience, this like movie about our childhood or whatever. That's what the explicit memory is, but then the implicit memory refers more to like how that lives in us implicitly. Right? It's just kind of an interesting use of language, because implicit means that explicit's like outside and implicit is within. It's like so much a part of us that it's not necessarily thought based, which is a way of saying like, how could like an early negative experience create an anxiety issue as an adult? Well, it's not necessarily thought based. These unconscious influences of past experiences on current judgment, feelings, or behavior. At a certain level, how psychoanalytic is that sentence? It's like there's you know, ogres have layers, or like onions. But yeah, it's like we're complex creatures, layers of mind, right? That could be the title of this presentation. But like, what's that mean? Layers, that, or dimensions, right? These coexisting processes. All right, let's keep going. So I think this is like, yeah, this is a cool thing. Studies in which unconscious processes are pitted against conscious ones provide the strongest evidence of the unconscious influence. It's like, if you could have this actual in, if you could have this in your note, it's kind of like this idea that when you compare it, it's overwhelming how powerful the unconscious is. It's like you see that classic Freudian example that I even showed you of like the iceberg that has like the little bit above the water and the big part below the water, and it's like the part above the water is the conscious and below the water is the unconscious, and it's like, if anything, that should be more closed in on the tip of the iceberg is the conscious. It's like so much of it's the depths of mind, right? There's considerable evidence that we can be unaware of. So this is almost like this is Kunda in 1999, kind of interestingly, exactly 100 years after Freud's interpretation of dreams in 1899, saying like basically what Freud's saying, that we're unaware, we can be unaware of these influences of these various experiences on. And think of what that actually means. Like, it's more than just a sentence to write down. It means that sometimes how we feel, like our judgments, our thoughts, and our feelings, we can sometimes have judgments, thoughts, and feelings that even if we had all the time in the world, we couldn't explain where they're coming from. And it's because they have these links to our past. And this is the whole idea of psychology. This is the whole foundational underbelly concept of psychology, is that things matter, things influence things later, that we're a being that has energies, and energies can get trapped and confused and fixated, or complex, turned into like a complex. What does even that mean? Like some weird configuration of energy. So like, what does it mean to have an early trauma that you don't understand and can't process, and how could that affect things later? It's like complex. It's so complex that like Jung even called those kind of things like inferiority complexes or trust complexes. Or and what's the word complex? It just is exactly what you think it means. It's a complicated thing. It's a dynamic. And even what's a dynamic? It's like connected things that are connected complicatedly. And this has been a bit of a wild rant, but I think this is actually the absolute heart of psychology. And how's that first slide? I think that was like, we, yeah, and this is the ending of the sentence, right? Is has power too. These influences, these things that are unconscious and influence us, like they're influencing us whether we remember them or not. Even if we're unable to recall the original experiences. And one of my points here is that there's a piece of this that's a little bit jarring or upsetting. That's like, well, so what I'm is sort of the undertone of what I'm saying, that we're kind of steering the ship of our emotions and mind less than we think, and not necessarily less. It's not that we're not in control, but that what's in control, we're not just like a thought-based. We're not like Descartes thinks. We're not just like this split between body and mind. We're actually like our body and our emotions and our biochemistry and all this stuff. Like, because your unconscious is part of your body. It's like wild to think of. It's like your deep mind, right? But it's you. And this is why Freud upset people so much, because that's what he's saying. It's like you want to think that you're like, remember in Victorian Europe, like you want to think that we're all proper and reason based. The whole Enlightenment was around reason, and it's like, and that's great, and it led to the development of science and all kinds of amazing things. But we also have these other levels, right? We're not just thinking creatures. Okay. So subliminal, or this idea of like, and we've heard the idea of like subliminal perception. This is gonna date me a bit, but like I remember, it's a weird example, but the old Saved by the Bell show, there was an episode where Zach made this song that played on the announcements, and it like he put in this message in the song that all the girls would love Zach, and then it like backfired on him, because then everyone was like zombies chasing after him, and it is like a silly show, right? But the reason why I thought of that is like, I can remember even as a kid being exposed to that idea of like a planted message, right? Like a message within usually hidden within media, and subliminal perception sort of implying that, well, can I show you something that influences you, but if you were asked about it, you would say you didn't see it, right? So if I like showed you a glass of water, but so fast you didn't notice it, but then it made you more likely to buy water, we'd say that's like a subliminal prime. But if you actually notice that water, then it's not subliminal, right? So as soon as you would notice something, it's not subliminal. That's by definition, subliminal means you didn't notice it. It's at a level of exposure that doesn't register high enough to almost like notice it. It doesn't pass like a perceptual threshold. It's subliminal. It's below that. Just to use the word a bunch of times, right? That's what it means. So I see here, it's possible, this is coming right from, all this is coming from the same book. It's possible to flash a word or image in front of you so fast you have no awareness that anything's been flashed and no ability to report on what you've seen. Okay, so they've done a lot of experiments with this, right? Like they'll like prime people with stuff and then give them cognitive tests and see if they're more likely to like circle those words or do it or prioritize those words in any way. Like, can what I prime you with have any effect? If, so the second part, if despite your conscious experience of it, or sorry, despite your lack of conscious experience of it, you didn't notice that I flashed that water. If it still influences you, we could argue that you perceived it subliminally or subconsciously, right? So that's almost like, it doesn't matter if you think it affects you or not. If I can show you something and you say that you don't experience it and it has any effect on you. So basically I'm saying what defines subliminal perception is like the effect. Number one, that you're not consciously aware of it. And number two, that it actually influences behavior. And they've done so much experiment with subliminal perception. It's like, and subliminal messaging. And it's like, because that's the flip, right? It's like, can you subliminally perceive the subliminal message? Like saying thirsty, thirsty, thirsty really quietly in the background audio of a movie, and then seeing if ticket sales, or not ticket sales, but like concession stand sales show more people buying pop or whatever. And they found that you can do that a little bit, right? Like you can get, if you can, that specific example, you could get people to like be more likely to, a little bit more likely to get a drink, but you can't, it's not so specific. You can get them to like get Diet Coke instead of Coke. And it's, they basically, the advertising world has largely dropped subliminal perception just because there's other types of advertising, and more direct product placement is just so much more powerful. It's not that there's nothing there. It's just that it's, first of all, it's super sneaky. It's intrusive. Most people don't like the idea of being lied to. In lots of countries, you're actually not allowed to subliminally advertise. I think the States is one of the only countries you actually are allowed. Yeah, there's weird laws around that. I don't think in Canada you're allowed to subliminally advertise. So a subconscious or a subliminal influence would mean that it's like influencing you, but not at the level that you're actually noticing, which is, again, a pretty wild idea. Okay, so I encourage you to write down these 2 points, and I'll sort of explain it. It's saying like, why do me and you look at the same situation and not see it the same? And what Kunda is suggesting is that, well, we make different automatic reactions to the same thing. And the reason for that is like a whole bunch of things. It's like, in a certain way, it's the same thing as saying like people have different worldviews or different perspectives, or they see the world differently, or it's like, no. It's just that like you have different automatic reactions. That's like another way of saying it, and it's cognitively more accurate. It means that what you're automatically associating with things and how you're contextualizing it and how you're setting things in association with other things, and you see this person related to this person and blah, blah, blah. Your whole background story, justifying everything and how you stand in relation to it is different than mine. And that's why we see things differently. We're making different automatic reactions, judgments, interpretations, associations, connections, depending on our differences in our cognitive and our affective structures, right? How we process both cognitive, like thought-based stuff, and affect, or like emotion. Are idiosyncratic, which is like the opposite of the word common or universal, or like everybody's the same. Idiosyncratic's the opposite of that. Idiosyncratic means like very specifically me. our idiosyncratic pattern of automatic association to differential situations, to like just situations, to different situational cues may lie at the very core of what we even call personality. So let me just say that sentence again because I stumbled it a bit. This idea that our pattern of responding differently, both mentally and emotionally to things, that pattern and what we call personality are basically the same thing. Your personality is basically a cognitive and affective pattern, affective, like emotional. And then there's also like a major, obviously, behavioral component. But from a social cognitive perspective, we're looking at that, right? Like what's the thought, what's going on in the computer of your brain that's sort of analyzing and processing all this stuff and making sense of your experience. And that difference in how you're processing and making sense of your experience compared to mine is sort of like saying that's the difference in me and you. And like it's what we would say is like we have different personalities, we're different styles of persons. Okay. You might want to add this point too. In all these experiments on priming, right? And remember, at the most basic level, priming experiments are just this idea of like, can I flash something to you and then show you something else and have it influence, right? Like if I put the word eat and then I put S-O space P, are you more likely to see that as eat soup? But if I put hand and that same thing, would you see it as hand soap? And like that, whether the word that comes before is priming, right? But it's like the more time pressure you're under, the more likely a prime will affect you. Or so I just say that like people can really override the priming effects if you have time. There's this, the stress mind is more susceptible to a prime. Okay, so I'm going to get into this idea of how resources or scarce resources, which just the next slide is going to be called scarce resources. And it's like, well, what's that mean? It means like not having enough, especially not having enough time, and how not enough time makes our brain sometimes take shortcuts in social processing. In some ways, this is actually a pretty profound insight that one of the ways you can see the difference between things that are conscious and unconscious is whether adding more cognitive tasks to your current kind of working memory processing interferes. So what that means is like I can be nodding along to music relatively automatically and brushing my teeth relatively automatically and like looking like doing something else, and those things aren't really interfering with each other. They're like kind of it's like the bandwidth demand from those is very low. But like if I'm trying to explain this right now and then I'm also trying to read something and then I like tried to do a math problem at the same time, it's like that's too much. And it's like, why? Because there's a more of this limit on the controlled processes or on these conscious processes. And I say there in the second point, this idea leads to an important insight that it's almost like it's possible to determine whether a process is being controlled, conscious or automatic, sort of like unconscious, by examining whether or not it's disrupted by increasing the cognitive load, by like adding that extra task. Right? You can tell that like explaining something in a lecture that you're recording in your laptop in the basement is like a conscious act that I'm like, so like me trying to do other conscious acts at the same time is taxing and interferes with my ability to do this. So that's like almost definitional of a controlled process, whereas the tendency to not interfere, like being able to listen to music and brush your teeth and like, look outside at the birds, and it's like, well, you looking outside at the birds and like processing what kind of bird it is, that's like taking cognitive resources, and brushing your teeth in the right way and blah blah blah. It's like all these things have demand, but the idea is like when it's automatic demand, it's almost like a different kind of thing. It's like hardwired differently. It's like it's an Ethernet cable, whereas like your conscious mind's more of like, I don't know, Wi-Fi and it like gets disturbed if everybody's trying to watch Netflix and do Zoom at the same time. It's a crazy way to end that slide, but you see what I mean? It's like, well, why does it stop working when everyone's trying to use video stuff at the same time? Because it's too much cognitive demand. We'd say like bandwidth demand. And it's sort of that same conceptual idea. That's the difference between conscious and unconscious, sort of. It's funny, I just rewatched that slide. It's kind of funny making like, I'm like, and that's the difference between conscious and unconscious, sort of. But that's sort of how it is, right? That these things are almost so complex that you have to almost talk about. What I mean is like how an early childhood event affects your emotions as an adult. In a certain sense, we can all be like, yeah, we could see how that would be the case. But in another sense, if you actually try to describe how that's the case and what that actually means, you realize that that's about as complicated of a thing to try to explain as there is. It's like, what do you mean an energy from a memory that you don't even remember is like interfering with your ability to have stable emotions 25 years later in specific relational style situations? It's like, well, that's what the word psychodynamic means. These highly complex, interconnected workings of these different layers of minds, these different dynamic layers of your psyche, psychodynamic. This idea from Wagner is like pretty interesting too. He says the iconic processes in thought control. That one of the weird things about this is, and you've all experienced this, unfortunately, I don't mean to bring up bad things, but it's like if people have been dumped and you're like, and we all have, and you're trying like not to think of the person and all you can think of is the person, that our attempts to mental control often result not only in a failure, but in an intensification of the thought that we're trying to suppress. In other words, when we try to control our thoughts, we often experience an ironic reversal, is what they call it, which is like, ironic reversal just meaning it's kind of ironic that the very act of trying not to remember something makes you remember it better. It's the reverse of what you would want. The more we try to suppress a thought, the more it can plague us. So that's what Wagner said was this iconic process of thought control, right? This is actually like an interesting aspect of the human mind that yeah, it's hard to consciously suppress thought, and the very action of trying to do that can actually solidify it by having the memory repeat. Okay, so look at this. So in this example, right, the guy with the purple tie comes in, and the guy with the red tie looks at him and sees, okay, well, he must have got in. He must have like slept in. He doesn't care. Like you see the guy in the red tie, you see what he's thinking in his head, that like, oh, it must be this guy. He doesn't really care. He's like sleeping in. It's his fault. You see in the purple tie guy's head, he's looking at it and he's seeing, well, it's not my fault. It's the traffic, right? Flip on the other picture, it's basically the opposite, right? The person with the purple tie is looking at the red tie and saying, oh, it's because of who you are. The person with the red tie is saying, oh, it's because of the traffic. This is called the fundamental attribution error. I have a definition on the next slide. Fundamental meaning happens all the time. Error meaning it's a mistake. Attribution meaning why we think something happened. And it's this tendency to, if I'm late, it's because of the traffic and Tim Hortons and everybody, people can't make up their mind in line and the traffic and people don't know how to park and blah, blah, blah. It's all like the situational environment is why I made a mistake. But if you made a mistake, it's because of who you are as a person. And the problem is we all do that to each other. So we all overestimate how much the environment is affecting us and underestimate how much it's affecting others and underestimate how much personality is affecting us and overestimate how much personality is affecting others. So we make this mistake all the time, and we do it to each other. I explain away my mistakes more from situational factors, and that's both not just my mistakes, also my it's easier for me to see how the environment affects me than to see how it affects you. And the problem is that's also true for you, and that's true for everyone. And so we're all coming at each other from this angle where we're underestimating how much the environment's also affecting everybody else. Right? So when we're looking towards other people, this fundamental attribution area is this underestimation of how much, okay, so if I'm looking at you and seeing your behavior, I'm underestimating the constraints of the situation or the environment, and I'm overestimating how much it's because it's you, right? You're late for class, oh, it's, or late with an assignment, oh, it's because you don't care about it. I'm underestimating maybe, oh, it's because your boss called in, you had to work late, and you're recovering from someone else, and you're actually showing a lot of loyalty and determination and, responsibility, and it was actually a good thing, and you're trying to balance all this stuff, and I'm not weighing that. I'm just seeing it as like a personal flaw in your like dedication, and it's an error. It's making me read you wrong in an error-based way. And again, it's like, why is the word fundamental in this? Because it's something we do all the time. One of our biggest blockages in understanding and connecting with each other is that we all have this tendency to see our own life as this movie that's heavily influenced by the situation, and to see everybody else as just a reflection of their core, even though we know that we're different in situations. It's the most fundamental, one of the most fundamental errors, and it's an error at the level of how we attribute or say why things happened, why you did this, why I did that. Okay, you don't have to write this down. I'll just read this to you, and if you wanted to pause it and write it down, you could. This is sort of a summary of this first segment, right? And then we'll move on to, I have sort of three segments that I want to, or three, I don't know why I'm using the word segment, three chapters of the book I want to talk about. So this is sort of wrapping up this talk around automatic processes. I'll read this to you. It now appears that when we observe a person behave, we jump automatically to conclusions about the person's underlying traits, but can correct these judgments to account for situational constraints only if we have sufficient cognitive resources. So that's a super wordy way of saying we jump to conclusions that people are doing the things they're doing because that's the type of person they are, and we underestimate the situational constraints or environmental factors is another way to say that. And we do that more when we are either stressed or overwhelmed or don't have enough time, when we don't have sufficient cognitive resources, or so he's saying like, okay, we can, let me just read that again now. So basically the idea is our tendency to over assume that the person's doing it because they're late because they don't care, and they're the type of person that doesn't care about stuff, as opposed to, well, obviously they would have been there if they wanted to, but they probably had trouble with traffic and parking and all that stuff. It takes effort to consider situational factors, and the more your cognitive system's already strained, the less effort you're able to put towards those things. It now appears that when we observe a person behave, we jump automatically to conclusions about the person's underlying traits, but can correct these judgments to account for situational constraints, so to understand the environment correctly, only if we have sufficient cognitive resources. This is one reason for the fundamental attribution error. It also appears that successful suppression of undesired thoughts requires a conjoint operation, open intentional, controlled search. Okay, and open. So all these words, like this is great example of Kunda, right? Like it's a deep idea if you spend the time to break apart what this language means, because if you read it fast, it's just so wordy. It appears that the successful suppression of undesired thoughts requires this operation of open intentional controlled search for distractions and a search for unwanted thoughts. So you can suppress. So now think about what this is saying, because this is complex. It's saying like me, say I like ran into an ex and I wanted to like not think about it. So now I have to try to get myself to think about something else, and I have to notice when I'm thinking about that thing again and direct my attention away. So that's what that's saying. It's like the conjoint operation, meaning just like two things at the same time. One, you're looking for ways to distract yourself, and you're looking for examples of when that is so that you can hide almost from it. And this is where we get to this idea where we actually make ourselves have the thought more. When cognitive resources are scarce, the controlled search for distractors is disrupted, but the automatic search for okay, now like think about this. It's like, well, why can't you get, why do you keep thinking about the thing that you don't want to think about? And it's because thinking about the thing you don't want to think about is automatic. Distracting yourself from that is controlled. So when you lose focus on distracting yourself from it, when cognitive resources are scarce, or when you're stressed, or when you're tired, or when you're upset, cognitive resources are scarce. You don't have as much brain power, sort of, energy-wise, not IQ-wise. The controlled search for distraction is disrupted, but the automatic search for the unwanted thoughts continues unabated, resulting in hyper-accessibility of unwanted thoughts. The hyper-accessibility of unwanted thoughts. Right, which is the exact opposite of what you want. You don't want your unwanted thoughts to be hyper accessible. Now, you may have noticed it already, but like one of the issues with like cognitive psychology in general, and also social cognitive psychology, is that, which is very different than social psychology, that's a whole different thing. This is a branch of cognitive psychology. So why I say that is, like, when I went to Waterloo, the psychology department, there was like a evolutionary biopsych department, there was like a clinical psychology, there was social psychology, which was always sort of the easiest. There was organizational psychology, cognitive psychology, which is where this would land. Right, with like cognitive, clinical, and evolutionary kind of is the most elite of them, and developmental psychology would be under evolutionary, like, so biological, evolutionary, and developmental psychology are all sort of, in my mind, like, or not even in my mind, in terms of type, branches of the tree of psychology. They're in the same subdivision. Why I'm saying all of that, how I got onto that point, you didn't need to have any of that. I was going to say that sometimes one of the critiques of cognitive psychology is that it's like super wordy, right? Like even just Piaget calling things like accommodation and assimilation, when he could have made the words more like, having a game plan and adjusting your game plan, and then everybody understands the concept immediately. Some of it's like breaking down the language. But then my point is that sometimes the language is like more complicated than it needs to be. But then sometimes Kunda even writes this pretty like super clear, and I like her introduction to this chapter. So this is chapter 9 of the book, and it's the same title here, like knowledge about others' attitudes, behaviors, and personality. And as I mentioned earlier, like this is sort of a 3-chapter book review. So let me just read this to you, just one page. Much of our social behavior is governed by our beliefs about other people's likely reactions. What will they think? What will they do? Our ability to answer such questions accurately may determine the quality of our decisions and the effectiveness of our interpersonal strategies. Just how good are we? Sorry, I messed that up. Just how good are we then at estimating our peers' likely attitudes? So, like, how good are we at knowing what each other think? Our peers' likely attitudes, beliefs, and habits. How good are we at predicting people's future behaviors when we know how they have behaved in the past? This chapter addresses these questions. In the first section of the chapter, I examine the ability to assess the popularity of various attitudes, norms, and behaviors. I point to some systematic biases that color our attempts to determine how many people share our reactions, so that we sometimes exaggerate and sometimes underestimate the extent to which others react like we do. I also note that we nevertheless are capable of estimating the distribution of various reactions in a population with various accuracy. So this is what we're going to look at here. We're going to look at how we're not actually as good at understanding like what people think on positions and how common ideas are, and again, like this idea, right? Our knowledge to know what other people actually think and why they're doing what they're doing and what their personality is. When we observe people's behavior, we often jump to conclusions about their underlying personality far too readily and have much more confidence than we should in our ability to predict their behavior in other settings. Right? We think that because this person's like this here, they must be like this here, and it's like the point is that we overestimate our predictive power because we're underestimating environmental influences. Again, we're trying to look at this, our social processing. This is probably my 6th, maybe 7th try at this slide. I keep getting kind of tongue-tied and tripped up over trying to explain like this false consensus idea as bluntly and as straightforward as I can. And it's really this concept that we sometimes assume that other people think like we do, but they actually don't. We think that we have consensus, that you agree with me, and when that's not the case, right? So false consensus is when people's what you think yourself influences what you think other people think, and you think that people are like you, but it's error. There's an error. It's a falseness. When people's own choices and attitudes and beliefs bias their estimate of those of other people, leading them to view their own reactions as relatively common, while viewing the alternative reactions as more uncommon. It's this relative effect. You don't have to believe it's your own group is in the majority to show the consensus. It's not necessarily just straight statistical. It's just this idea that our brain has this tendency to think that what we think is the normal thing to think. Even if we know that, even if you know that, like, say it's like political and it's like what you feel is right feels like that's right, even if there's like a bigger number of people in the other group, that there must be some right? So it's not necessarily statistical. It can exist even when you don't overestimate the proportion of people that agree with you statistically, right? So like the example that is a common so basically it's saying like the human mind has this tendency to view what it views as normal as what other people might view as normal. It almost goes back. It's this in a weird way to way earlier in the other course when we talked about that idea of theory of mind, like a difficulty in seeing other people's perspectives, but this is at like a belief level. Not everyone observes the same theoretical or like vision orientation towards understanding the world. We all have our, but we all, and this is because it, of course, how you see things and how you think shapes how you see how I think, right? Because you're using your brain to guess how I think. So obviously your brain's going to shape how you envision how I think, which isn't necessarily how I think. So this false consensus idea is both like sort of simple and super difficult to explain. Because really it's saying that we understand that people have a different mind than us, but we don't necessarily understand what that actually means. So that example of like people, if you ask people that smoke, right? And if your parents smoke and if your uncles smoke and the people that are around you smoke and your brother smokes, and it seems like everyone smokes and it feels very normal and it seems like everybody is accepting of it. And, right, people's estimates on how common smoking is are heavily related to the amount of people that smoke directly around them, right? That yeah, it can feel like there's consensus around things where there's not really consensus. Right, so I have here for you like 3 reasons to kind of explain reasons for how this false consensus thing happens. And number one is you just don't know people's opinions about everything. And you're kind of always limited by the number two there. You're kind of always limited by the people that you're exposed to. And when that didn't come out right. The availability heuristic, or heuristic just means rule, and availability means like who's available in your world or in your sample, which just means the people that you're, if you're saying like it seems like everybody smokes, it's like, well, that means that the people in your world, the sample of people that you're making that statement from, has a high number of smokers. And it's like, right, so it's not necessarily like an accurate statistic. It's an availability heuristic. You're making this assumption that everyone smokes based on the fact that you're exposed to a lot of people that smoke, not necessarily because statistically a lot of people do. That's what's called the availability heuristic. Right, and then that third one that kind of plays into the same thing, that the people that are around us all the time influence how common we see things as. Right, so if we hang out with 5 people and the 5 people that we hang out with, we do this one thing that's like not a lot of people do, but we do it all the time. It's like in that group, it's like super common. It's like, yeah, so it's just, again, another just psychodynamic process, this false consensus effect. Now, this is a wild idea. Like, think about during the last, you know, global sickness and around like things like masks or whatever, and say like at your school, I don't know what it was at Nipissing, but let's say that you had to wear masks, and say a bunch of you didn't want to, but no one's saying anything, and everybody's going along with, saying that the emperor has nice clothes, and everyone's going along with everything, no one's complaining, and so it seems like everyone's going along. So if I'm having a problem with it, it must be me. I must be like the only one. This is called pluralistic ignorance, the fact that we're often unaware of the other people who also don't agree. The situation in which almost everyone actually privately rejects something, but because no one's sort of actively saying anything, there's more of a projection of people accepting it than actually exists. Not aware of how many other people don't agree with the common push, whatever it is. This is Alport's work. Super interesting researcher. This is an old idea, right? Like Alport wrote this idea in 33. Okay, pluralistic ignorance. That's a good term to know. Power of aggregation. What does that mean? It means like, okay, the power of understanding multiple situations. So what this means is, say if I've seen you stressed out once, and then you're going to be in this future situation. It's like, well, did me seeing you once in this situation help me understand how you're going to be here? Well, not perfectly, but what if I saw you in a whole bunch of situations and I had like kind of a whole mapping of your behavioral pattern and your emotional pattern of how you handle situations? Basically, if I knew your traits and your personality, it's like then I'm actually starting to get a bit better at being able to predict. It's this idea that traits are better, the second point, traits are better able to predict behavior than a specific instance, right? It's one example of how you behaved here doesn't necessarily predict how you're going to behave here, because maybe on this day you were having a really bad day. So I see you once at a store, I'm the cashier, you come in and you like are rude to me, and then you leave, and then I see you 3 months later. It's like that first time's not necessarily going to predict it. But if you've been like that every day, it's like that pretty much does predict it. So it's like, and you all sort of know this, but this is interesting because this has like social psychology or social cognition implication, because it's like, even though the correlation between two specific things, like this behavior this day and this behavior this day, is low, the correlation, the direct causal relationship or correlation, like this is related to this, they're correlated. Once you see the behavior over and over and over in that pattern, right? Like a trait is a pattern basically, right? Even personality is just a pattern. It's a pattern of behavior and emotional and cognitive responses and patterns of interpretation. And it's your pattern sort of. It's like, and your pattern is more predictive of how you'll respond to a random future situation than any one of those instances, right? It's basically like saying any one thing you did in a situation isn't as predictive of what you'll do next time as your pattern, right? Like so much of who we are is a pattern, whether we want to switch the word pattern to habit or tendency or, style. Okay, the last like little summary point I wanted to pull from this was just this idea that like we can be very mistaken when trying to predict the behavior of other people. We often fail to realize that even though people's behaviors is quite consistent over time within a situation, it often changes in different situations, or like the situational factors are different. So knowing a person's personality only shows us so much. Okay, one more section. Okay, so now we're 2 down, 1 to go. All right, I'm gonna wrap this up pretty quickly. Um, I know this is starting to get, I'm at like an hour 15, so I'm gonna get to the point here. But this last little bit I want to do is on the chapter called Determining What Is, What Was, and What Might Have Been. Okay, so this is kind of this is the last chapter I want to cover from this book by Zivda Kunda, this Making Sense of Ourselves. So if you remember that this is trying to look at this idea of cognitive bias, right? And the positive test strategy is the idea that when people are doing this, it's not like it's a positive thing. It's that people aren't being critical in like the actual use of, nowadays critical thinking traditionally means this idea of like not just blindly accepting everything you're told. It doesn't mean like being critical of everything. It means being searching for the truth in the information you're exposed to, not just blindly accepting everything that people tell you. But it's like a positive test the hypothesis approach is like sort of no one can tell you anything. You already know what you know. You're just looking for more and more evidence to support what you already think. You're just looking for more and more positive tests that show your point. So it's a way like it's like basically if you're trying to say, oh, this sickness is really bad, and every test that shows it, you're saying, look at this, and every test that shows the opposite, you're ignoring, or whatever, right? That wasn't the greatest example, but when you use this strategy, you test a hypothesis by seeking cases that match it. You're only looking for the things that support your idea. This broad strategy might serve you well in a case where the evidence is clear-cut, but if the relevant evidence is mixed, this strategy would bias your evaluation. People use this strategy to evaluate hypotheses both when searching through their memory, so it's like it's also that you're only looking for examples, right? You're like, oh, this person, I don't like this person, and it's like now all of a sudden you're doing this like search through your memory only for those examples that support the idea of why you don't like them. You're not looking for ideas that would counter it. Like you're doing this positive test. You're only looking for positive responses. You only want, it's like a bunch of people do the test. You only want the ones that answered the way that you want. It's almost like that with your own memory system. And it's like you're only, not only that, you're only looking at within yourself, within your memory system for examples that kind of support what you're saying, and then also only looking for examples in the world that sort of re-support. It's like nowadays you hear words like echo chamber or whatever. It's like, and people on all sides, I'm not aiming at anybody, I'm aiming at it, sort of everybody. It's that, and our way out of it as like all of us, hopefully, is that we like address face on. I used the word brainwashing earlier, which is probably a bit strong of a word, but like we've all been exposed to basically this like intense amount of whatever messaging from every level on every issue. And there's very little people that are standing there saying, what about the effect of all this? Obviously, the mental health crisis is, if not a direct offshoot, has been exacerbated substantially by it. You can't just look at the evidence that supports your idea, or else you're doing this positive test strategy. You're just living in a delusion. Yeah, check out that for a picture. I'll just have it take a quick coffee break to give you a second to look at that. Objective facts, what confirms your belief. That's a picture worth 1,000 words. Okay, now think about this. Hypothesis confirmation when evaluating others. So hypothesis means like well, in theory, a hypothesis is supposed to be an idea that you can test. But, right, so like in an experiment, you would have a hypothesis. You think that this is related to this, or that this would do this. And so then you create some experiment to test that hypothesis, and then you write up your findings, and then that's like what science is. But again, this whole presentation isn't necessarily just about that. This presentation is about these cognitive errors that we can make that lead to bias, but also not even just bias. Like bias people think bias just means like being prejudiced or something, and it can mean that, but bias at a more deeper level just means that you're not seeing things accurately, that the position you're looking from is shaping how you're seeing things to the degree to which it's a threat to accuracy. It's not just preference. Cognitive perspective bias is different than preference. Your preference might be that you like certain things better. Bias is that there's almost like a bug in the system that's shaping the interpretation of even new knowledge and the review of past knowledge, like when you think about stuff. When we have mixed evidence, okay, it's nothing about this. So it's like if you only know a little bit about a person and you don't like the person, it's easier for you to kind of shape everything about that person in ways that confirms your hypothesis. When we have mixed evidence about a person, entertaining a one-sided hypothesis about that person can increase our hypothesis, right? It's like if your friend's telling you about this person they're dating and about how they treated them not like maybe they were like, I don't know, I'm struggling freestyling an example, but if like say you don't want to like the person, this politician that you hate, think about everyone's most hated politicians, and say you really hate the person, it's like you don't want to be spending time reading stories about how they're actually like a decent family person or whatever, right? It's like a reliance on this positive strategy will bias towards things that confirm, right? While like making us much slower. Like I even read this, I talked about this in a different presentation, but it's like when you read so say if somebody reads a scientific study that supports an idea that they have, they almost never are gonna be like, well, I wonder how many people are in the sample, right? So say if there's some test that they do some study and they survey all these students and it finds something and that finding is what I already think. It's like my brain doesn't jump to question how valid the study was. But if the study found something that goes against what my idea is, all of a sudden it's very common for my brain to be like, well, how did they come up with that? I wonder how many people were in their study, how blah blah blah. It's like we're slower to accept the stuff that doesn't go along with what we already think. And why is that a problem? Well, it's a problem because it's not a problem if you accept that it's only a problem if you think that you're actually critically taking in stuff and you're like seeing things accurately. If you don't care about seeing things accurately, then it's not a problem. You should care about seeing things accurately, though. Right? It's like that clarity of mind, that vision, that sight. It's right. It's like an ancient saying is all not lost if one cannot author their own thoughts. It's like this ability to have clarity of mind is so key. Okay, that's why I'm including it in a course like this. It's like I'm trying to, and I don't know, I'm taking a bit of chance with this. This is like a presentation that I think is interesting, and I'm kind of trying to approach it a little bit differently today and just kind of talk about these concepts and how they maybe apply, right? In this self versus other, or just the complicatedness of being a conscious being in a confusing, complex social world with others. Okay, so these are all one of the reasons why some of these like studies are difficult to explain is that they're sort of confusing because they're trying to get to like they're trying to challenge people in certain specific ways to get to certain levels of processing in the mind. It's very different than like some like animal experiment where you're doing something that's like very observable. It's like here you're trying to like say, okay, can we like almost prime you in this way? Can we get you to like, can the way that we ask the question influence how you're viewing yourself? Right, so you can see the sub question there, like, can self-view be influenced by how we ask a question? Like if I ask you, how many times are you happy? Right, so that second one, participants asked whether they're happy recruited more happy thoughts and fewer unhappy thoughts than those asked about how often they're unhappy. It's like almost how you ask the question cues the mind to pull forward certain examples. It's why you have to, honestly, it's why you have to be careful with like, this is a weird thing, but this is almost like personal advice, but it's like why you have to be a little bit careful of being like bitter in your own mind and like complaining, and whether out loud or in your own mind to yourself. Because it can cue that, it can just keep that feedback loop going. So it appears like that one-sided question, like even something like whether you ask the people whether they're happy or whether you ask the people about how much they're unhappy, it's like even just the framing affects how people think about the question and how they then respond. It appears that when a one-sided question, no, it appears then that when one-sided questions do bias self-views, this is due to how the one-sided question affects how the search of memories happens, right? So it's like, why is it easier for, or why do I report more happy days when the question's asked a certain way than another way? It's not that I'm like lying or just the wording is tricking me or whatever. It's that it's triggering a different type of memory search. All right, this is another one. This is my third try at this. Some slides are harder to explain than others, and it's just that like, as much as you see me get rambly, please know that like sometimes I delete ones that are even worse than the ones that I let make it to the final one. It's like this is kind of a complicated topic, except it's sort of also not, because in the same way that we can be biased towards only searching for examples that confirm what we already think and only looking for patterns that we already see, what that can do is it can have us fail to detect actual things that exist that are patterns that are just not fitting our thing, right? So it's like we have this certain model of how we see the world, how we see things, and it's like we're only interpreting it in that way. And the problem is not only that we're force feeding everything into that interpretive understanding, we're also not seeing other things that are real, other connections between things that actually do exist but don't fit neatly into our, interpretive framework, worldview, position, spell, mind, way of seeing things, whatever term you want to use. In the absence of a prior theory, right? If we're exposed to some thing, and this sort of is obvious, right? It's like obvious that you don't know about the connections that you don't know about. And at a certain point that's obvious, and it's like obviously if like something is connected, if like, I don't know, the direction of the wind is connected to like something related to magnetism or something that like I couldn't explain, but it's still a real thing. And it's like that was a completely like off to the side example, but the point isn't really just that. The point is that when we get hyper focused into a certain map of the world, one of the problems with that is that we don't see other things that don't fit that map. It's like we're so locked into this interpretive pair of glasses, that we don't see things that don't exist within that framework, even if they're real things. People may be inaccurate in their assessment of unfamiliar correlations, but can be accurate in their assessment of highly familiar correlations. It's like we're good at seeing things we've seen a bunch of times, and pattern recognition is like, right? But again, it's almost like, just to say it one last time, and you can see why I've started this slide a few times, and I'll like make this point and then get out of this slide. Humans are pattern recognition creatures. One of the benefits of that is we can learn complex social patterns related to things like understanding people's personalities and how we can interact differently with people and blah, blah, blah. One of the problems with that is we can get so entrenched in those patterns that it can interfere with our ability to see real connections that exist outside of our interpretive framework. Okay. All right, you survived the presentation. The last thing I want to just read. When testing hypothesis, right? Like, so the idea is that we have these understandings of the world, or our ideas about things, and those ideas are actually like, in theory, hypothesis, right? Like, you have an idea of that things work a certain way, and then if you have evidence presented to you that that's not the case, then maybe you change your idea. And so we have these hypotheses, and we rely on people often rely on these positive test strategies, which entails seeking cases that match the hypothesis. And people use this strategy both when searching their own memories for pre-existing knowledge and when searching the external world for evidence that bears on this hypothesis or supports the hypothesis. When the evidence base being searched is mixed, containing information that confirms a hypothesis as well as disconfirming information, use of a one-sided test strategy can bias people towards confirming the hypothesis. So again, just a super wordy way of saying that when we're out in the world and we see things that both go along with our story and go against it, this positive test strategy biases us towards the information that kind of confirms what we want to think. Because information about the social world is typically mixed and inconsistent, we may often be biased towards confirming any hypothesis and entertain any hypothesis about our own or other people's attributes. Right? Like, so basically, because there's so much information out there, because there's so much easy to get caught up in our own kind of, the word you hear a lot now is echo chamber, but like even at a more individual level, it's difficult to keep kind of constantly. I heard someone say this was an awesome quote. If you're going to be critical about everything, you have to also be critical about your criticalness. And yeah, maybe I'll end on that point. All right. I hope you got something out of this. This presentation, I know, was like a little bit different. I tried to present these ideas of Zivda Kunda. I thought that she was a little bit of an outside the box thinker on some of these topics, and hopefully, even if this made you scratch your head and wonder what I was talking about a few times, hopefully, I don't know, hopefully a couple of the examples at least spoke to you. All right, thanks for being an awesome group, and see you next time.